All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us in this session of CISO Live webinar sponsored by Stealth-ISS Group. A few house cleaning aspects. We're not here to sell you anything, just here to provide information. Today's topics is around CUI data as it applies to CMMC compliancy. We hope today will be informative for you. And if you have any questions that haven't been addressed, please put them into the chat within the Zoom, and we'll try to answer them during this session. If not, we will follow up post a Zoom meeting and try to get those answers to you. Real quick, I want to introduce our panelists today. We have Harry Kruckenberg. He is from Saudi Solution Services. He is the Executive Director of Development. Thanks for joining us today, Harry.
Thank you, David. Pleasure to be here.
Also, we have James Pim, and he is the CMMC Program Manager at Saudi Solution Services as well. Welcome, James.
Thank you, David.
And we had a few other people scheduled today. I don't know what happened to them. Maybe the internet gods messed up their connection to their location. So we'll see, hopefully, if they join later and we can let them in. But let's get started. So today we're going to be talking about CUI data as it applies to CMMC. I think there's a lot of questions around that on how to define it, how to create programs around it. But I always like to, at the top of this, start off with if those people that are still getting into CMMC get the confusion between 1.0 and 2.0. So Harry, do you want to just give a quick summary on where we've journeyed from initially in the controls and the levels to where we are today on 2.0?
Yeah, happy to. So in fact, we've been talking to our customers quite a bit about this topic, and we've done a couple of webinars on this very topic recently. Essentially, CMMC 2.0 simplifies and streamlines the original version of CMMC to a certain extent. It takes it from a total of 5 levels down to only 3. So what were levels 2 and 4 have now disappeared, and we're left with level 1, which is concerned with protection of federal contract information only. And if you're dealing with CUI or controlled unclassified information, then you're looking at level 2 as a minimum. And then level 3 is considered to be for a fairly small subset of defense contractors, those that are protecting against advanced persistent threats and the like. So the thinking is that most defense contractors will fall into levels 1 or 2. Also, with 2.0, the requirement for a lot of the documentation, although not all of it, was reduced quite a bit. And then, there are the Delta 20 controls that we often hear about. The original model for level 2, which was level 3, had 130 practices associated with it. And with the CMMC 2.0 model, now level 2 is only concerned with the 110 controls or practices that are inherent to NIST Special Publication 800-171.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think there was confusion on those aspects. There's confusion today on what they need to be at, considering that CMMC 2.0 isn't complete. But sitting on the town halls with the CMMC AB and the DoD, currently you are required to be NIST 800-171, which has 110 controls in it, and you need to be submitting your scores, and you need to be working towards that 110 perfect score. Going forward, when they lock it in, all things that we've heard so far, and I don't think it's going to change, they're going to have the framework be off of the 110 NIST 800-171 controls for levels 2 and levels 3. Level 1 has not changed the 17 practices. Those continue for those that have CFI. And really quick, do you want to define for those out there the difference between CFI and CUI? James, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So, so federal contract information, FCI, both the definitions are quite broad, but essentially, if you have any sort of government or federal contractor or subcontractor, you likely have FCI. And the definition basically says it's information that is not for public release. And then CUI takes it a step further, and it's also information that's not for public release, but then it also has additional safeguarding requirements. I will tell you, both definitions are incredibly broad. And I think we were going to get into a little bit with some of the questions as part of the panel of, the different types of CUI and some resources that you can consult that should hopefully make the picture a little clearer. Candidly speaking, there are a lot of questions about what CUI versus FCI, and even knowing what type of CUI you have, what kind of CUI can significantly impact, some of the decisions you'll make in terms of the technology you implement and how you handle it. So I think we'll get more into it, but at a high level, those are the definitions.
Appreciate that. So with that being said, let's get into the initial questions on CUI. How do I define CUI in my environment? I think that's a big question for most people out there. How do I define it? How do I identify it, mark it? So, Harry, you want to start with that?
Yeah, and that's kind of the $1 million question right there is how do we, in anticipation of the CMMC requirement, how do we identify that information? And in a perfect world, and once we get to steady state, whatever that looks like, the thought is that it would be clearly spelled out in your contract. The requirements holder for the contract will clearly identify and mark CUI. It'll be very clear, similar to how classified information is treated today and has been for years. But the truth of the matter is we're not there yet, and it'll likely be some time before we get there. And if you're an organization seeking certification under CMMC, you have to take steps to identify that information and prepare for certification now. So it's a tough question though, and as James pointed out, the definition is fairly broad, but there are some things in there that we can look at and give us a clue. For defense contractors, most CUI that they're dealing with, in most cases, is a subset, and it's controlled technical information. So things like research and engineering data, engineering drawings, specifications, standards, technical reports, even data sets and the results of studies and analysis could be considered controlled technical information, and therefore a subset of CUI. But it's basically anything that a regulation or a law and restricts the handling of or requires special handling of that information, according to the definition.
And I've heard a lot of people joke and say anything besides your company address and phone number is pretty much going to be identified as CUI from the DoD, because a purchase order saying how many that the government's ordering, even if what they're ordering is not totally classified, it may just be a part going into a classified project, a machine shop, and they're making a little metal widget, and that little piece of metal, isn't a microchip or software with encryption data sets on it or anything, but it's going into a missile, and the government's not going to want the enemies to start to, capture all of these bits of data, and they can start putting things back together and say, oh, United States is ordering, X amount of missiles from Raytheon of this type. And so sometimes it can seem mundane as far as the data, but to the DoD, those pieces, if you have several of those disparate pieces, the enemy could put that together and grab some intel. So
yeah, we've talked to companies that are in, fairly, innocuous businesses such as packaging and shipping. So, the packaging of the item may require a drawing or dimensions, and having that information on your system is very likely to be considered CUI. So you're right. It may not be as obvious as, a drawing or a data set or a design or a blueprint, and still could be considered CUI.
very good. Well, let's get to the next question here. So in identifying that information, that brings up a good point of classification within the networks. And when we're dealing with medium, small to small businesses, they're probably not used to those type of controls or processes that an enterprise organization goes down in data classification, role classification. And why don't we talk, about the benefits of that? Because as you classify that data and then you understand where that data is, a company can save money, because when you start talking about the technology that you need to put in, you can create enclaves, and you don't have to put the same technology across the whole company if that data is going to reside in a certain spot and only a few people are going to be touching it. You don't need to apply, the encryption to 100 machines if there's an enclave and a separation, and only 10 machines are ever going to touch that CUI data. You want to talk about that, James? Classification and separation.
Yeah, absolutely. And just, for everyone's situational awareness, 2 websites I highly recommend you, take a look at if you haven't already, and if you haven't recently, to do again, is, one, National Archives or NARA. The CUI registry is on there, and they have some, helpful videos about the CUI program, generally speaking. If you are a DoD defense contractor, which I'm assuming a lot of you are, definitely look at the DoD CUI website as well. They are separate websites. And if you haven't, I would highly encourage you take a look. There is if you go to the DoD CUI website, there is the CUI training, mandatory training for government employees that anyone can take. It takes under an hour. I can promise you it's not going to solve all your CUI problems or questions, but it's a step in the right direction and gives you an idea of, how data should be labeled, that CUI data, because, as Harry alluded to, one of the really difficult parts of this, and, I can tell you from, we're in an interesting situation that, one, we are a defense contractor ourselves. And we also provide, managed services, IT and cyber, to defense contractors. And so we've gone through it ourselves, and we've also tried to help our clients. And, the first thing we encourage our clients to do, and ourselves, is, one, talk to your government customers, because in most cases, it should be on the program office or possibly the contracting office to label the CUI correctly. And it's very clear, when you go to both the DoD and NARA websites, of what there should be. There's a bunch of fields. It should indicate the type of CUI. And like Harry talked about, that is largely not happening. And that's really hard, because I can tell you that whether, there's a lot of companies out there that just have FCI. There's also a lot that do have CUI. The difference in what you need to implement around protecting those different types of data are many, many thousands of dollars. And they only become bigger differences the bigger the company you are. And for a lot of small to mid-sized defense contractors, they've been underspending on IT and cyber for many years. And, in the last couple of years, since NIST has gotten more publicity and CMMC is, scaring people, they've reached out to providers that know about this sort of thing. And, they may have a current IT provider, but, when they talk to somebody that really understands NIST and CMMC, it's quite a bit more expensive. And a lot of them are having a difficult time, coming to grips with those costs. They just, they haven't been things they've been spending on for quite some time. But it's just so important to know what is the type of data, because it's going to drive all of those conversations you have of what you need to implement and what processes do you need to build around protecting that data. So I think that's, start with those two websites, take the training. It's not going to answer all your questions, but it will be helpful. And the other document out there that I would say is very helpful is, the CMMC scoping guide that came out in, early December of last year. The DoD did give us all some breaks in terms of, some tangible first steps, I would say, are, figure out what are your assets, like literally what are all the assets your organization has, figure out which ones are touching which types of data. Is it only FCI? Is it also FCI and CUI? And start there and kind of go from there. And I know we're going to get into that a little bit more as we go through the questions.
Yeah, no, that's a great place to start. And what you brought up about the MSPs is a good point. And we partner with a lot of MSPs, and there's a lot of good ones out there, but there are ones that are not so good. And I don't know if it's intentional or ignorance, but that's a great place to start. Also, if you have outsourced your IT infrastructure or management of it, make sure you're asking the questions that these MSPs have an understanding of compliances. Most do, but some are low-hanging fruit, and they're just there to supply server reboots and desktop support, and they're not really versed in a lot of the compliances. And that brings up a point to being compliant, even with NIST 800. Things that they're doing as an IT admin for you, they need to be documenting and processing, because the controls require it in DFARS and NIST. And if they're not doing it to the way that the compliancy wants, you could have all the technology in place, but you could fail on processes and policies within your environment. So it's really important to understand the type of MSP you're working with, and that the technology services you're getting will comply with the type of controls that you need to put in place and meet those controls. So encryption, maybe they've put encryption in your system, they've turned on BitLocker, but they've only done AES 128-bit. You're not going to be compliant to NIST 800-171 or CMMC. You have to have, FIPS 140-2 level of compliancy, which is a 256-bit encryption. So those are easy fixes, but you need to be aware of that. So as you're working with an MSP, this is why it's so important. This is not a sales pitch, but to work with qualified consultants around CMMC that can help guide you and help you work with the vendors you already have to make sure you have the right services in place. And if not, to look to switch those so that you're lining yourself up to be compliant, and you're not wasting dollars as you're putting technology within your environment. With the categories, this brings up a good point. Who wants to grab what are the categories of CUI? Can we go through those a little bit?
Sure. Harry, you want me to take that?
Yeah, you're probably a little better versed than I am.
Yeah. So at a high level, and again, I highly encourage you to go to both the NARA and DoD CUI website. Both have information about this and some FAQs that are helpful. But at a high level, the two categories are basic, CUI basic, and CUI specified. And there is a whole boatload of categories. So, I would highly encourage it, one, take that training first, and then go through and look at the different types of data and see where the data, you believe that you're receiving, what buckets they fall into. And then especially for CUI specified, it is very likely that there are other regulations that may pertain to that specific type of data. For instance, nuclear data has a lot of other regulations that, are surrounding protecting that type of data. The other thing I would encourage you to is don't just think about the data that you have right now. I think it needs to be a coordinated effort around your entire organization. I know, and I don't know if some of you in line fall into this bucket, but CMMC and some of these compliance type things, they tend to be viewed as an IT problem. It's definitely way more than an IT problem. And as an example, let's say you're planning to go after contracts that maybe you don't have CUI now, but these future contracts might, or maybe you have certain types of CUI now, but your future contracts could have certain types of CUI specified that, regulations that don't pertain to you now. That needs to be a coordinated effort, among not only the folks that are overseeing your compliance and your GRC, but also your business development folks, because, they could be far down the road on BD efforts for months, sometimes years. And if you don't have the infrastructure in place to be able to, be awarded that contract, that could all be for naught. So I would just, encourage you to not only think about what type of data do you have now, but what type of data do you plan to have in the future?
Great, thanks, James. And you know what? I just got a message from Jared Hoskins, who was supposed to be one of our panelists. He lost power to his facility, and he's working to join back in. But this brings up a good side point. Backup plan, business continuity. How are you going to operate if you don't have power? How are you going to operate if your computer gets locked up and run your business? So something just as a side note to throw out there for people, you need to be thinking of these things as your overall business strategies and plans for your organization. You need to have a backup plan in place. You need to have a disaster recovery plan in place. You need to have a business continuity plan in place, and all three are different. They're interconnected, but business continuity is not disaster recovery, and so forth. So so hopefully Jared will get his situations in place and get back on. But sounds like a trip backup battery system is in need for him. Maybe we can get Trip to send him one. So, all right. Well, appreciate that, James. And did you have anything to add to that, Harry?
No, James nailed it. Between the basic CUI basic and CUI specified, the point he made about trying to anticipate requirements is a very important one. Especially for small and medium-sized businesses who intend to grow, right? You may have a unique opportunity that can allow you to grow, but if you're not prepared for it in terms of what's required to store that information, then that door suddenly closes for you. So it's as much a strategic business opportunity as it is in decision as it is a compliance approach and decision.
Absolutely. And again, reiterating with businesses, going forward, I don't know if the DoD is going to give the same type of ramp up that they were going to with 1.0. I believe once they put 2.0 in place, which is pretty much mirroring NIST 800-171, which has been in place since 2018. So there should be no surprises in that aspect of at least the 110 controls that has already been established by NIST for a long time that you need to be operating to, that you have your IT manager sign off on as you submit your SSP plan to the DoD that you're doing. And so that's something people need to understand. Don't wait right now. If you're sitting back waiting why they're making the sausage for 2.0, you're going to be in sad shape once they put it in place, because there's going to be organizations that will already have everything mature and in place. And when they go to award, they're going to look at the two companies and they're going to look at the scores and they're going to say, hey, this company has their ball together and the other one doesn't. And guess who's going to win the award? So, and they're definitely going to use the compliancy as part of the factor, not just the bid of financial anymore. It's too important to the Department of Defense that their ecosystem of contractors and subcontractors be secure, because we haven't been in the past. Unfortunately, too many people have checked the boxes and not really took on the methodology and the understanding of what it really means to have a mature security posture and reduce the risk within their environment. Great, let's bring up the next question here. How can I create a CUI program? So Harry.
Yeah, so that's a complex question. There's a lot to unpack there.
Where do they start? So
yeah. Where do you start? So you start with the requirement, right? You start with 800.171 and CMMC. 800.171 tells you what's expected of you in terms of managing and protecting CUI and going from there. But David, you brought up an important point earlier, is choosing the right MSP for a I would say for the vast majority, especially smaller defense contractors, they're going to need qualified assistance, right? And that starts with choosing the right technical and security partner to work together.
And that usually requires, Harry, an MSSP as well, because exactly. Most MSPs are not qualified for some of the more advanced cybersecurity work.
Correct.
They do backup. They put a little more advanced endpoint than antivirus, and they write a rudimentary disaster recovery plan, and they think they're doing cybersecurity. And
right.
And those are pieces, but that's far from the totality of everything.
Right. Right. So the managed services on the IT side as well as the security. And then from an internal standpoint, setting up your practices and your processes to ensure that you can sustain a secure environment in going forward, which includes, specific assignments of responsibilities within your organization, and putting a CUI, designating a CUI, POC or program manager to lead the overall effort.
No, I appreciate that, Harry. And a lot of smaller companies are just like, well, I don't have enough staff, and you do have the ability to outsource, both from a procedural policy aspect of who is controlling that or managing that. It doesn't always have to be internal. You can outsource like a fractional CISO, a couple hours a month, and you can accomplish a lot of the policy and procedure controls within NIST 800 through that assignment. And that does Correct. Two things. One, you don't have to worry about the cost of a full employee and a person that's versed in that. And two, if you have employee churn, that's a lot of training and handover and all of that costs a lot of money for smaller organizations. And if you outsource some of these things, you have that outsourced organization that's going to be there and fulfill that, and you're not going to have the churn. So appreciate that, Harry. I got a question here from the chat room. It says, one of the requirements for CMMC is to identify the data flow of CUI and segmentation. Can you please provide some recommendation for clients to address this, how to do it, what the output material should be, and or what is expected? James,
yeah,
you want to go for it?
Yeah, I can take that one. That's a great question, Dasha. So, just take a step back for a second. A couple of key things that you definitely need, for CMMC and NIST, I would say both really. One, a system security plan. If you don't have a system security plan, you technically cannot even submit your self-assessment in the SPUR system for NIST, which I'm going to assume if most of you are on the line already know what that is. And if you don't, please send us all a message afterwards, because we're supposed to have done it by, I guess, what was it, November 30th, 2020. So yeah. we've definitely received a couple panic phone calls. It was closer to that timeline of, I need to put my score in Spurs and I don't know what I'm doing. So if you haven't done that, please do and reach out to someone that can help you with that. But so system security plan is huge. Specifically to Dasha's question, I would say a data flow diagram. So when you're receiving this data, how is it flowing in or how is it flowing out? That's a huge misconception I think a lot of people have is, yes, a lot of data is flowing from the government to primes and subcontractors, but there is quite a bit of data that is generated by contractors on behalf of the government that also can be considered controlled unclassified information. So that's really important. It doesn't necessarily need to be something flowing from the government to contractors. It can be flowing the other way. And if you are a contractor that's doing that, it is certainly your responsibility to make sure that that data is labeled correctly. I mean, even if you are receiving data from the government to you and it's not correctly labeled, there is responsibility on your part. It's a little bit unclear the exact specifics of this, but you have responsibility to make sure that data gets labeled correctly. I would also say, as part of your system security plan, which is basically your plan, not only just your plan, but how are you actually implementing all 110 controls? Or if, let's say, only level 1 applies to, perhaps it's just the 17. You should have things like a boundary diagram, because one of the huge things when it comes to CMMC is, what is the scope of your network, if you will? Is it your entire organization? Is it a certain part of your organization that only touches CUI? Because that's one of the biggest things. You can really do yourself some favors or disservices depending on how you go about scoping. And I would highly encourage, if you hear nothing else out of this, take that DoD CUI training and read the DoD scoping guide. It's actually not that long of a document. I don't know, it's 8 to 14 pages perhaps. And go through that, because it pretty specifically labels, the different types of assets, and that is going to significantly impact your scope. And the size of your scope is going to significantly impact your cost. And just, what you need to protect, right? I mean, do you want to try to protect an entire country, or do you want to try to protect, a very small portion of that? Because, this stuff is expensive, and the less real estate you have to protect, it's probably going to make things easier on you and less costly. So those are just a couple of key things. The other thing I would highlight is pretty much the scoping guide requires at this point that you need what's called a shared responsibility matrix. So if you are using, the scoping guide refers to it as external service providers, whether that's a cloud provider, an IT provider, a cyber provider, all of the above, you're going to need in a document when you go through your assessment of what is for each control, and even a step deeper than that, for each assessment objective. Everyone knows the 110 number, 110 controls, but there's really 320 assessment objectives. And those are the little bracketed letters beneath each of the controls, the A through H. Some of them just have 1, some of them have 12. So for those 320 assessment objectives, what are you responsible for? What is your external service provider responsible for? And what do you have shared responsibility, between the two of you, or perhaps more parties, and who is responsible for what? Because that needs to be very clear to a C3PO that's coming in to assess your organization.
No, that's a great point, James. And it's your responsibility to know what your vendor is responsible for, and to validate that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing and documenting what they're supposed to be documenting. It's not the vendor's responsibility at the end of the day when an assessor comes in and, oh, I didn't know I was supposed to do that. You as the business organization have to define with all of your third parties that are involved what they're on the hook for, that the service that you're buying that's going to contribute to those controls within your environment, and to manage that. I just wanted to make some clarification, and I agree. Milt said outsourcing CISO for security compliance, sure, but not for CUI POC. needs to remain internal. I totally agree with you, Milt. I wasn't saying you could outsource everything. There are some pieces you can outsource, but you can outsource the CISO to manage an internal CUI POC person to make sure they're doing their job, but you're right. And James, you want to just clearly define, I think that was one of our questions, was who manages a CUI program? So
oh man. Yeah, so this goes back to that whole, this is not an IT problem. And without knowing the size of everyone's organizations that's on the line, let's just assume that you're small to mid-size, right? And I'll define that very roughly as, I don't know, 500 employees or less. And I apologize for any of you big dogs on the line, but if you're 500 employees or less, depending on what your organization does and the sophistication and how much is corporate staff versus folks that are perhaps on task, if you're in the defense world, this is going to vary. I can tell you for most small to mid-sized defense contractors, folks are wearing a lot of hats, and that becomes a problem for this type of thing. Ideally, if you had at that size, you're probably not going to have a CISO, a chief information security officer. You're probably not going to have a chief information officer. Maybe you do. That's maybe more likely at this size. I've also seen, a lot of times facility security officers, FSO, they tend to be kind of the gatekeepers. I would say it's just going to be unique to your organization, but I do think whoever has the, most visibility when it comes to the types of data that's going in and out, that person definitely needs to be involved, if not leading the effort. I also do think it's going to be somebody that has, CMMC NIST familiarity and just familiarity with CUI, generally speaking. I know sometimes those folks tend to fall into, the contracting part of your organization. I would say there is some training out there that can help, right? We talked about some of these resources that are available. I will say I personally went through the CMMC certified professional training a few weeks ago. That's definitely the best and deepest training that I'm aware of is available right now. It's not cheap, but I thought it was worth it. You can't even take the CCP exam yet, but at least you can get the training. I don't know, Harry, do you have any other thoughts on who would be the right person? We've just seen such varying things. Sometimes it's as simple as like an IT person. I don't know that's necessarily fair to that person.
Yeah, I think you covered most of the more popular options, James. A lot of times it falls to IT, and I'm not sure that's the right answer. There's certainly more responsibilities than just from a technical standpoint, and those resources already have full-time jobs, right? So,
and for the smaller companies listening out there, the DoD is surely not expecting you to go hire 20 employees to fit all of the roles if you're a tiny company. There are exceptions, right? You can write exceptions to each role. You just have to make sure you're documenting that in your SSB and who's doing what and why. And if you don't have 5 other employees and there has to be multiple hats, then you just have to clearly make sure that you're documenting that within your plan. So there are ways around it. With smaller organizations, they don't expect a little 20-employee machine shop to have a CISO and a director of IT and a risk compliance manager and all of this. So, all right. How can I protect my CUI documents? That was a question that came in.
Well, it's everything we've already talked about. So next question. You said have fun with it, David. So
absolutely.
Yeah. So it's, to me, protecting it implies and requires that you control it, right? And you have constant documented control over that information. And that includes, knowing first of all, what it is. What information are you talking about? What files, what data sets, how and where is it stored? Where and how does it move? To James's earlier point, as the organization, the defense contractor, you may be creating CUI. Understand what that information is and how it transmits and how you share it with your customers, and as much, if not, to a greater extent, to how they're sharing that information with you. And then, who has access to it, limiting, controlling that access as appropriate, and what level of access. Not only can they access it, but what can they do with that information when they do access it, and making sure that there's control around all those pieces and all those considerations.
Yeah, and this is where working with the consultancy that is versed in this, or C3PAO firm, starting off with a gap assessment, because they can come in, look at all of what you currently have, and then write that summary report of all of the gaps and begin working with you. That's why having somebody to come in and guide you when you're not familiar with this is so crucially important. And as you went through there, Harry, I was listening. It's like, okay, there's some technology there. Okay, there's some policy and procedures there, and there's people there. Yep. So it's not one thing. You can't just take technology and throw it at your network and your company, and that solves everything. Unfortunately, it doesn't. It has to be all three. And like Dasha said, as far as the question she had earlier, mapping out the flow. How does the data come in from the contractor or from the DoD? How's it encrypted in transport? How is it encrypted in rest? Who has access to that? Who has access to the keys? All of these things have to be a consideration of managing that data. And it seems overwhelming. And if you've never put security programs involved into your company, yes, it's daunting. I'm not going to say that this isn't daunting at first. Once you get through this pain point of getting procedures and policies and technology and people trained, the maintaining part's not as bad. That there's an uplift initially getting to that level and getting used to it, like anything else, like going to the gym and getting into a routine. And training the people is just as much as important as the technology that you're putting in place. So I think I have another question here. It says, many companies are looking at GCC and GCC High and Microsoft 365 and SharePoint and moving their CUI there. What do you see as the biggest risks here, or what do clients need to consider besides moving it into the cloud and hoping all will be taken care of? Well, I'll start off and then you guys can jump in behind me. There's many things to consider. First and foremost, there are other technologies besides GCC High to meet the compliancy of that controlled data and encrypted in the cloud. So some companies can afford that. Not every single company can afford that type of technology. If you take best in class across the board, it would put a small business out of business. So there's a lot of other options out there in the environment, not tons, but there are some other options that will meet the compliancy, the more cost affordable. Two, putting it across all of those areas, how are you monitoring that? A lot of times people will put an endpoint agent in, and maybe they're doing a managed service where they're having somebody put it, but that managed service isn't watching the cloud, isn't monitoring the cloud. You're missing out on some security pieces of understanding how to control that. Anybody else want to jump in on that?
Yeah, sure. I was wondering, I was like, we can't get through this panel without GCC and GCC High coming out. So, those are definitely the mainstream. I would say this is just my opinion, representing no one else. GCC and GCC High are definitely the mainstream avenues for a lot of defense contractors. There's some other alternative tools out there like Anchor and Prevail. And, I think somebody from Ignite was supposed to be on. I just personally, I'm not very familiar with Ignite, but there are some other encryption type tools out there that are, kind of being pitched as alternatives to GCC and GCC High. There is quite a price tag difference just between GCC and GCC high. You know, I think roughly, depending on the types of licenses, GCC high can be anywhere from 40 to 60% more than GCC and commercial. Commercial and GCC are fairly close in pricing. The tricky thing that we try to help a lot of our clients navigate is going from commercial to GCC or going from GCC to GCC high is just not like flipping a switch. Like, it's a full migration, and you know, that's why it all comes back to what type of data you have, right? Because and whether you're CUI basic or CUI specified has huge implications, because, you know, you may say, okay, I know I have CUI, but I think it's only basic, so I'm okay with GCC. And then all of a sudden you get, you know, something with, you know, GCC specified indicating nuclear or no foreign or whatever the case may be. And all of a sudden GCC is no longer sufficient on its own. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to jump to GCC high. You know, that would be one path. There are some of these other tools out there that potentially could be a, you know, a workaround, if you will. But at some point it becomes, you know, there's just a lot of different ways to skin the cat. And I do think as let's call it the CMMC market matures a bit, I do think there are going to be alternatives, hopefully out there, that are more cost affordable. The other thing that we're going to have that will be helpful is, you know, what we like to call CMMC case law. You know, companies that went through actual assessments and, you know, what was sufficient and what was not, what worked and what didn't work. And I think that will be helpful too. To Dasha's point too, and this kind of goes back to the IT thing. So if you're fully in the cloud and are able to do that, you know, God bless you. But a lot of companies are going to have, you know, either they have to have an on-premise, you know, environment for whatever the reason may be, or a lot of companies have hybrid environments now, right? Like they may be in the cloud, but they also may have some on-premise servers. And there can be varying reasons for that. But if you go through the 110 controls, or right, that we're going to remember that 320 number assessment objectives, a lot of them, a decent amount of them, have nothing to do with IT. You know, so there's things like physical protection and personnel security, right? These things, you know, can they involve clouds? Absolutely. But, you know, whether you secure the doors to your building or to server rooms and that sort of thing, you know, can they involve technology? Absolutely. But they can also be, you know, that you have the proper locks and that sort of thing. So,
right, you have a printer and you're printing out a drawing that's CUI.
Yep.
Is that in a locked room? Who has access to that? Did you leave it on the printer? So
Right.
Yeah. And it's amazing too, like when they had the CMMC like pilot program before that got scrapped with 2.0, you know, they had, even before the pilot program, they had done some mock assessments. And it was interesting to hear some of the DoD personnel talk about that. A lot of the reasons that companies were failing these mock assessments had nothing to do with like technology. They were things like people were propping open back doors with bricks, you know, like things that are huge security risks, but they're simple things. You know, some of these things are not simple, but some of them are quite simple.
Their password was on a sticky note, right?
Yeah.
On their screen, right?
Yeah. So that's huge. And that's the other thing too, you know, Dave, you bring up a great point of like, sometimes I think we can all fall victim of overcomplicating things, like requiring too many password resets, in my opinion, is not a good thing. Or making, I think there's an appropriate amount of complexity for passwords, but there's also, the more complicated you make a requirement, the more likely that a person, right, that's part of your CUI scope is going to do something to undermine all of that, like writing it down on a piece of paper, that it doesn't matter if you had all the fanciest tools in the world, you know, an assessor walks in and sees that, you know, that's game over right there.
Game over, right?
Yeah.
So you're not requiring your clients to do 128 password refreshes a year. Okay, that's
we're
good.
not.
Well, great. Well, we have about 10 minutes left. I wanted to see if you guys have any stories from clients you worked with, and of course, let's anonymize. We don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but we want to use this as a, let's share those experiences, bad and ugly. So other people listening, like, okay, can I avoid that? Or I have that right now and I need to address that. So any come to mind?
I have a funny story related to what we were just talking about with passwords and the sticky notes. This is not one of our clients. It was actually a former colleague of mine, was on a webinar just like this. And, you know, he wanted to share on a popular social media platform that he was part of this webinar. So he took a picture of his screen and then posted it on social media. Well, at the bottom of his monitor was a sticky note that said passwords and had all of his passwords there.
Oh my God.
So we joke about those kind of things, but it happens.
They're real, right? It's human nature, right? We always like to take the path of least resistance, but you know, cybersecurity is something that is here to stay with us. And it's not just in our businesses, it's in our personal lives too. And I think the more people understand that they have to adopt that and adopt the mindset and training and constantly, I mean, how many people's networks have been hosed because of phishing? It had nothing to do with the firewall, had nothing to do with the endpoint, had nothing to do with the encryption, servers, accounting servers being locked down. It had to do with human error, somebody being stupid and not looking at the URL and clicking on an email. You know, all the technology in the world is not going to stop stupidity. So we have to constantly, you know, push towards the education piece as well, and education programs. You know, I don't know. Most small businesses don't have that. They don't have a cybersecurity training program in their environment, and that's just as important as everything else that we're talking about.
Yeah, and that education and training is hugely important because, you know, if you try to, you know, engineer a system to make it, you know, foolproof or you know, to protect against every, you know, silly act that you could think of, then it'll become useless. So
that's called an air-gapped room with the computer turned off and nobody gets inside.
Exactly. Yeah, it's perfectly secure, but now it's useless. So so there's definitely a balance there, and training is a huge part of that. And that's something that, you know, I know there are controls and requirements that are related to that, but I don't think there's been enough dialogue or emphasis on the training and education piece of all this since the dawn of CMMC 1.0.
Right, even since the dawn of NIST 800. I mean, and that comes into play, James, when most of our talk today was about CUI data. You know, incorporating that cybersecurity training with employees about CUI data, right? So, you know, what if John accidentally, you know, copies another employee in the firm that never deals with CUI and sends it to him and didn't realize they sent it to him? You know, does that other employee have enough information to look at that and understand, wow, this is CUI data. We need to address this right away. I need to report it. We need to take care of it and control it and quarantine it and then make sure that doesn't happen again.
Yeah, and that's a great point, David, because training is literally one of the requirements. It's not even optional. It's actually part of the, you know, the assessment objectives and controls. And you know, just back to the funny stories, David. I mean, we have some real interesting ones, but you know, something that comes to mind is it is very common. Harry and I will talk to a company for the first time, and we'll ask them if they've done their self-assessment for NIST and submitted their score and spurs. And I will tell you, more times than not, we will be told, and again, I should say all this, we're not trying to make anyone feel bad. We totally get how difficult this is as a small to mid-sized defense contractor. But I do feel like knowledge is power when it comes to this sort of thing. And more times than not, we will talk to a company for the first time. They will tell us they have a positive SPUR score, and then will proceed to tell us how they don't have multi-factor authentication, don't do any backups. They don't know what a SIM or a SIEM is. And, we very quickly know that there's no way they have a positive score, right? So
Yeah, they do, because in that box, they put in process and then put a date of when they're going to. And so if you do that, your score will go up. If you actually have a date and you're in process, but that's just faking it, right? We all know that's. So
yeah. And that doesn't help anyone. I mean, I know a lot of people have, get nervous about putting a negative score in SPRS, but the DoD has publicly come out and said they were expecting a lot of negative scores. So I don't think the worst thing you can do is misrepresent your score. I have not heard once to date that having a certain negative score in SPRS has negatively impacted a company. Right now, the biggest negative in regard to that is if you don't have a score in SPRS and you do have CUI and are a covered contractor, we've received a couple of panicked phone calls like that. But, like you said, David, the first thing you got to do, right, get a handle on the data you have. And honestly, a lot of people are best served by just, talk, if you have the internal resources to do it, great. But if you don't, hire somebody that knows this type of stuff and is living it every day, because it is pretty nuanced. And this kind of ties into another thing you brought up about, for a 20-person machine shop trying to hire, their CMMC unicorn to do all this. It's very much that, a unicorn. These people are in incredible demand right now. I mean, IT and cybersecurity, just those two tracks alone are in such demand, but then add the DoD nuances to that. And I mean, there's literally a website that tracks the amount of cybersecurity openings in the US at any given time. And it's in like the millions range.
Right. And there's only like in the system, I think there's 40 that's been certified. There's another 300 or 400 that are in process, but that's not all C3PO. That can be RPO, that can be others. So let's say it's 400 in a country of 360 million. It's nothing. It's a drop in the bucket. So it's line up with somebody that, soon and early and start this process. And because, a lot of the things in NIST 800 and soon to be CMMC 2.0 take maturity, like log management. You can't just, start log management tomorrow, then, in 2 days apply for an award and a contract and expect to be, mature and passing. So this is really important. And the transparency, I reiterate, James, be transparent. It's okay. Everybody has to start somewhere. That is a heck of a lot better than lying on your SSP and having somebody sign off and saying it is and it isn't. That'll get you fines, and that will get you out of the DoD ecosystem to not probably win ever again. Or at least not for a while. And so
certainly not getting you any closer to compliance.
Exactly. And the other framework I wanted to say is that, all of this, don't just look at it as something for the DoD. You have to look at it as an investment into your own business organization. If you got ransomware tomorrow, how long can you run your business? And even if you had the backups done correctly, which, is your MSP even testing the backups? Are they, making the database backups done correctly versus fractional to where they know they can even restore? Even if all that's in play, disaster recovery, that could be 3 to 5 days. It's not instant for businesses that have never experienced it, that they think, oh, I'm fine, I can just be up tomorrow. No. One, if you don't have people on retainer, it might take them, a day or two to get to you, because there's other people they're responding to as well. Two, how can you run your business? So all of these things are investments into your business. The more that you make your security posture more mature and you reduce your risk, you're investing in your business. So any final words, Harry?
No, just thank you for the opportunity to have this talk today. I think, taking advantage of the opportunities to get the word out and to spread this knowledge, only helps. So, we really appreciate the invite. Thank you.
You're welcome. James, last words?
Yeah, just last words, David. That was a great last point. as somebody that's living and breathing this every day, it's easy to get wrapped around the, be compliant for compliance sakes. But the bigger picture here is you need to protect your data, right? Both government data and your own proprietary data, because, like you said, you could get hacked tomorrow. Somebody could access your proprietary data and that could be game over for your business. So yes, is it important to make sure you're meeting compliance regulations and that sort of thing? Absolutely. But it's more important to just protect the data and be secure and secure your business. So that's a great point.
Great. All right. Well, I think that wraps up another CISO Live. We hope you enjoyed today. Hope it was beneficial. If there's anything we didn't cover, don't hesitate to reach out to us, and any one of the panelists or ourselves, we're available to help. We're here to help. We're passionate about cybersecurity, and we're passionate about helping people become compliant. So with that, stay connected in YouTube on our channel. We do these every 3 weeks, and we'll have more on CMMC in the future. And so have a great day. Thank you for joining us. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care.